Glad to see everybody here this morning. We're studying in Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter. And last week we were talking about verses 17 and 18. I want to go back to it just a little bit, and then we'll go on and move on into some other things. Of course, Moses here is giving just some general instructions about a whole lot of different things, and these were everyday things that the people needed to remember. Before we go any further, there was two things I missed last week when we were talking about personal hygiene, and we got into some other discussion. It kind of got me distracted. I double clicked and missed some of my notes. I wanted to read a couple things that I found in kind of doing my research, because there was, in one of the commentaries, there was some stuff talking about the advice that Moses would always give in the Bible about how medically accurate it was. And it gave a couple of examples of some of the stuff that went on, and was actually, they found this in the medical texts in Egypt. The first one was about donkey feces. And it says that donkey feces was used for treatment of splinters. And they said that probably that wasn't the best thing to be using on splinters, because the donkey feces has a tendency to have a lot of tetanus in it. So they will, of course, obviously become infected and be worse than they were. And the other thing that I thought was kind of interesting was crocodile feces was used for birth control. So, I thought that was kind of weird. And you don't see any of that stuff in the Bible. The stuff that's in there about that type of thing is usually pretty accurate. But I thought I'd just throw that in just to lighten things up a little bit before we started. So before we go any further, I'd like for Keith Davis, if he would, to lead our minds in prayer.
Heavenly Father, we come thanking you for a night of rest. Thank you, Father, for the one that desires to be here to study your word. Be with David as he breaks the bread of life unto us. Be with us, Father, that we are receptive to what we learn. Use it for your good. We thank you for Jesus, your Son, and the sacrifice he made for us. In his name we pray.
Okay, so let's briefly look at 17 and 18 in chapter 23 of Deuteronomy. There shall be no harlot of the daughters of Israel, nor a sodomite of the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the hire of a harlot or the price of a dog into the house of Jehovah your God for any vow. For even both these are hateful hateful to Jehovah your God. So we were talking last week that the word for harlot was not a run-of-the-mill street prostitute, but a prostitute that was at a temple. And the word for sodomite in the original text pointed to a male prostitute at a temple. And they were referred to as dogs. And they were both present, and basically that was one of the ways that these temples got money. So these were considered to be holy prostitutes and holy sodomites in the text, that in the way that this was used here. And we note here that the price or any money that would be brought from that type of action would not be acceptable to be used in any type of worship for God, because he thought that was something that was unnatural and absolutely unholy, and it was forbidden for the children of Israel to, first of all, to have anything to do with that, and second of all, if they did have something to do with it, and they came to the sanctuary and tried to offer that money as an offering to God, the God would absolutely not accept that in his sight. That would be an unholy situation.
You said also any money that was produced
Was dirty.
We've gone through all the processes of sacrifice to God.
We didn't want dirty sacrifices.
Right.
This certainly would, in a sense, be a dirty sacrifice.
And this was something that was all around the children of Israel, because this was a very common practice in the Canaanite religions.
Baal and Ashtaroth were the two that were key to that practice.
Right, and I mean this was something, they were going into a foreign land, and this was something that was all around them. And prostitution obviously violates the spirit and also the letter of the seventh commandment about adultery. So I mean this was a pretty serious situation. Any other comments about those verses?
No, but it comes down to, as bad as this sounds, any illegitimate worship today is just as bad.
You're right.
People may think they're doing good, but if they're not worshiping according to God's word, they're just as bad as these people.
Right. I mean, all the way through in the Old Testament and the New Testament, God is very specific about how He wants to be worshipped. Any other comments about those verses? All right. Let's look at start at verse 19 and look at verses 19 and 20. We're changing the subject here, and like we talked about before, what Moses is basically doing in the previous chapters and this chapter and continuing on, he's kind of reviewing the Ten Commandments. And what we're kind of talking about here in this section, which actually goes into the next chapter, we're kind of reviewing the eighth commandment. So let's start with verse 19. You shall not lend for interest to your brother, interest of silver, interest of food, interest of anything that is loaned on interest. You may lend on interest to a stranger, but you shall not lend on interest to your brother, so that Jehovah your God may bless you in all that you set your hand to in the land where you go to possess it. Keep in mind, all these instructions were given prior to entering the promised land. So the Israelites lived in a simple state of society, and they were encouraged to lend each other in a friendly way without any type of gain. In other words, they shared things. If somebody needed help, you would go help them. If somebody needed a piece of equipment, you'd loan them the piece of equipment. If somebody got themselves in a situation where they needed a little bit of money, you gave them a little bit of money, but you didn't loan it to them. Now, they were expected to pay it back, but it wasn't a loan situation. Now, this was a different case with foreigners. If you did the same thing for a foreigner, you were allowed to charge some type of usury or charge some type of interest on your money. I suppose it could kind of be expanded that you could rent things to the other people, but not to your brother. God was going to bless the Israelites for loaning these things and doing this without interest. They were going to get a blessing for it. They weren't going to get any. Their interest was going to be stowed up. In other words, with God. So
a lot of scholars say that the implication of this, if you treat your fellow Israelite right and do things properly, even with foreigners, that God would probably enrich them even more than that they would have received in
other words. Mm-hmm. So this is an admirable distinction between the Israelites and between the non-Israelites. So there could be an interest charge to the non-Israelites. This is also discussed in Exodus the 22nd chapter, verse 25. It says, "If you lend money to one of my people who is poor beside you, you shall not be to him as a money lender, neither shall you lay upon him interest." It's also discussed in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 35 through 37. And it says, "And if your brother has become poor and his hand has failed with you, then you shall help him. Yes, even if he is a stranger or a tenant, so that he may live with you. You shall take no interest from him or increase, but you shall fear your God, so your brother may live with you. You shall not give him your silver on interest, nor lend him your food for increase. And this applied to all Israelites, not just the ones that you knew, but the ones that you didn't know also. It may be somebody who's a stranger. And there were a lot of Israelites. Everybody didn't know everybody. And there were different tribes and things along that line. So as they travel along, they knew that they could go to one of their brother Israelites and get the proper type of treatment. Another thing that I found in some of my reading, banking went on back in that time. You maybe didn't go down to the bank and take out a loan, but there was banking. People who had money would lend out money with interest. From what I can read, the interest rates were pretty exorbitant. It's kind of like going to see Uncle Louie. Uncle Louie's going to make you a deal. He'll only charge you 25% interest. And it's kind of the situation there where they had some pretty high interest rates. So, what God expects of his people is to be gracious to a needy brother. That comes over to the New Testament also. We're supposed to be, we're supposed to have that same attitude. You don't give loan your brother something on interest. You help your brother out, and that's just not money. That's pretty much anything, and that's a good trait for us to have and for us to practice. And when you do that, people notice. They don't, they might not come out and say it, but people notice when you do stuff like that, and the word gets around, and it reflects well on the church. Other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verses 21 through 23. When you shall vow a vow to Jehovah your God, you shall not wait to pay it. For Jehovah your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin in you. But if you shall cease to vow, it shall be no sin in you. That which has gone out of your lips you shall keep and perform, even a free will offering according as you have vowed to Jehovah your God, which you have promised with your mouth. So basically what we're talking about here is a vow is something that is voluntary. You say that you're going to do something. So if you say that you're going to do something, you need to do it. It's a fundamental thing. If you give your word that you're going to perform something, then you need to perform it. Failure to do that is tantamount in God's eyes to stealing from God. You made a vow, you made a promise that you were going to do something, you didn't do it. In God's eyes, that's the same as stealing. So God's people should follow through with their commitments, and don't commit to something that you're not going to do. That's what we're talking about here. If you don't commit to doing it, it's not a problem. If it's something that you can't do and you don't commit to it, there's no sin in that. Where you get yourself in the problem is you say that you're going to do something and you don't do it. And people don't like to be promised something that's going to happen and then it doesn't happen. Your actions is just as important as your words, and you need to follow through and have a reputation that you do what you say that you're going to do.
The classic New Testament example of that's Ananias and Sapphira, who had committed to contribute so much and didn't follow through with it, held it back,
and then lied about it. That's what we're talking about here. And we see here this follows through also into the New Testament. Comments about those verses. All right, let's look at verses 24 and 25. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, then you may eat grapes to fill at your own pleasure, but you shall not put any in your vessel. When you come into the standing grain of your neighbor, then you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not move a sickle into your neighbor's standing grain. So what God is talking about here, or what Moses is talking about here, is God would permit traveling Israelites to come into somebody's fields and pick some grapes to eat, or pick a little bit of wheat to eat as they're passing through. But they're not to put themselves in a situation where they start harvesting their neighbor's crops. That would be tantamount to stealing. It's, it says don't put it in your basket, or don't collect it in any way. And you basically have the opportunity to feed yourself based on your brother's work, but you don't profit from it, and you don't take any more than what you consume right there at the site. So here's another way which the Israelites were to love their neighbors as themselves. They were allowed they allowed other people to do it, and in reverse of that, when they would go to another area, they would be allowed to do the same thing. So God's people should be gracious toward the needy, and should not abuse the graciousness of their fellow believers. Take care of the needy, but don't abuse the situation. And that's the key to what's talked about here. Comments about those verses? Okay, let me do a little bit of modern technology here, and we will move into chapter 24. Okay, now we're going to talk a little bit about marital relationships and marital issues again. And we've talked about this before, and Moses has talked about it before, and he's going to go into a little bit more detail here. Verse 1, when a man has taken a wife and married her, and it happens that he finds no favor in his eyes, because he has found some uncleanliness in her, then let him write her a bill of divorce and put it in her hand, and send her out of his house. So what we see here is a man has made a choice to marry a woman and make the woman his wife. He has gone through all the procedures that we've talked about before of obtaining consent of the family, and they've gone through all the steps. And what we're talking about at this stage is the betrothal is over, the marriage has taken place, he has taken the wife home, and they have consummated the marriage. So this is not in the process. This is the process has already, and they are living separately in their house as husband and wife. So something along the line has happened, that the husband finds something in the wife that he is not agreeable with, and he takes no delight in his wife anymore. He has no pleasure in her company. He doesn't want to talk to her. It's just a bad situation, and there's some alienation here between the husband and the wife. And there's something that's happened that has caused the husband some type of dislike, and it's an uncomfortable situation, which can lead to some type of ill-natured feelings, some type of cruelty, possibly to the wife, even to the point where the life of the wife is exposed to danger, or she's in a very uneasy situation. In this case, according to the law of Moses, a divorce is going to be permitted, and this is the hardness or the badness of the man's heart, because he finds no favor in his wife. And he is going to, as it were, free himself and free her from the situation that they're in. Now we see the word uncleanness used in the text here. This does not signify adultery. It's just some other type of situation that is that is talked about here. Because if this was adultery, what would the punishment be? Stoning to death. So we're obviously here, what the wife has done or what the wife would do is not a situation that would be punishable by death. It's interesting to note there's a couple of rabbis that their names pop up in the commentaries and in the history books about this particular time. One of them was Rabbi Hillel, and one of them was Rabbi Shammai. And these were two Jewish scholars, and they had basically two schools of thought about this period of time and about the situation that's happened here. And from what I can gather, these two rabbis were living about the last century before Christ was born and possibly lived into after Christ was born. And these two schools of thought in the Jewish religion, there was a lot of very vigorous debate on the material that these two talked about, because they commented on the rituals of the worship service. They commented a lot on ethics, theology, things along that line. And from what I gather, they were both together very critical in shaping the oral laws that the Jews followed even up to today. Now, Rabbi Shammai held that a man may only divorce his wife for serious transgression, but Rabbi Hillel allowed divorce for even trivial offenses such as burning a meal. My dad always used to tell my mom that he always worshipped him like an idol because he got burnt offerings every now and then. Mom didn't like that very well, but she always took it. Well, you have to know my dad to really appreciate that. But anyway, so here the point is here, it could be something really serious or it could be something trivial. But the point is, the man was the one who was the one to make the decision. The woman really had no say in the situation here. So whatever the problem would be, then the man had the ability to divorce the woman. Now we note here that to do this dismissal, it was not done by word of mouth. There had to be a written bill of divorce. Now there's a lot of wisdom in that, because I don't know any marriage that every now and then doesn't have a little dispute in it. And husbands and wives don't always disagree on everything. And sometimes, the situation can get a little bit heated. And sometimes things are said that probably didn't need to be said. But in the heat of the moment, somebody says, well, I'm just going to divorce you. I've heard that threat lots of times. Okay, I'm going to divorce you. Didn't happen. Okay, everybody calmed down and got their senses back with them. But in this case, if you have to go to the thing of putting it in writing, it makes you sit back and think a little bit about what the situation is. And this bill was called the bill of cutting off. So it had to be written down and it had to be delivered or presented to the wife. Now, the Egyptians practiced this same, ritual or same way of doing a divorce. In Egypt, divorce was very common, but it still had to have it was called a certificate of divorce, and it was a written document that went through the process that was delivered to the wife, and the divorce took place from that point on. Now we see here that it says, and giving it in her hand, which was to be done before a witness, and one of the 10 requisites to a divorce. There was a process that had to be followed in this. And from what I can gather, there were several different ways that the message could be delivered to the wife. One of them was the husband could hand it directly to the wife. Another method was a representative or messenger of the husband could hand it directly to the wife. Another method was that the husband could hand it to a representative of the wife, or a representative of the husband could hand it to a representative of the wife, and that representative would put it in the hand of the wife. However it was going to happen, the wife has to have that paper of divorce in her hand, and it has to be follow the process that was given.
Second to the duel.
Yeah, sort of, and I'm sure maybe some of them they would like to have a duel. But anyway, and then the third part here I think is very important. And send her out of his house. Very important part of this divorce process. She was actually sent out of the house. And this was a visible token and a public declaration that she was divorced. So, if she would continue in the house afterwards, it would give suspicion that of cohabitation, which after the divorce was not lawful. Once the divorce happens, she's gone, he stays away from her. And that's how it was supposed to be. And if she stuck around in the house and cohabitated for a while, that was just something that was not lawful. Comments about those verses? That verse.
Dowry before she got married, she was allowed to take it with her.
That's in another section, right?
It was Jesus, the master teacher, taught on this in Matthew 19. If I can read it. Of course, he was always trying to be, the Pharisees tried to trip him up always. It's impossible. Some Pharisees came to him to test him. They asked, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Haven't you read? He replied, at the beginning, the Creator made them male and female, and said, for this reason, man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two but one flesh. Therefore, what God's joined together, let no one separate. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Master teaching right there.
Right. He knew because he was there in the beginning. All right, let's look at verses 2 through 4. And when she has departed from his house, she goes and becomes another man's, and the latter husband hates her and writes her a bill of divorce and puts it in her hand and sends her out of his house. Or if the latter husband dies, he who took her to be his wife, her former husband who sent her away may not take her again to be his wife after she is defiled. For it is hateful before Jehovah. And you shall not cause the land to sin, which Jehovah your God gives you for an inheritance. So here we have a situation. If a man marries a wife and he puts her away with the letter of divorce because she does not please him any longer, and the divorced woman marries another man and he puts her away in the same manner, the first husband could not take the woman back to be his wife. So the putting away or the divorce of a wife with a letter of divorce, which the husband gave the wife whom he put away, is assumed as a custom founded upon tradition. However, the Israelites took marriage more seriously than the neighbors did. This was not a very common thing that happened with the Israelites. But again, you've got the situation, they're surrounded by all these other things going on, and it was very common around them. So the tradition left the question of divorce entirely upon the will of the husband. So, it wasn't exactly equal rights back in that particular time. And it was a serious situation, especially for the woman. And it's a serious situation today, and there's a lot of consequences that go with that. Comments about those verses? All right, let's move on to verse 5. When a man has taken a new wife, he shall not go out to war, neither shall he be charged with any duty. He shall be free at home 1 year, and shall cheer up his wife whom he has taken. So the second situation that Moses is dealing with here is concerning a recently married man, somebody who takes a new wife. Such a person did not have to participate in military service for 1 year. And the reason for this provision was so that the man could establish a strong home and to begin to produce descendants. And because both a strong home and descendants were essential to God's purpose through Israel, and going to war and dying was figuratively like a type of stealing from his new bride or his fiancée.
Remember we talked about this 4 chapters ago and we kind of went into the fact that if you were a warrior and if you've just been married, your head's not going to be in the game if you would rather be back with your wife. Mm-hmm. Remember, he also talked about building a house, and they talked about planting field. If you were worried about that, you could be an effective soldier. Mm-hmm. And this goes right along with that.
While you were talking, I was just sitting here thinking, in Israel today, there is mandatory military service for every citizen, male and female. I wonder if this applies today. Mark, you ever heard that when you're in your world travels?
Yes, they still do.
They still do the year off?
Oh, no.
I know they still have the mandatory service, but I wonder if this codicil applies. Be interesting to talk to somebody. I thought that'd be something interesting to find out. Any other comments about that verse? All right, let's look at verse 6. No man shall take the lower or upper millstone to pledge, for he takes a man's life to pledge. So here is a situation where somebody loans a piece of equipment and pledges to, or there's some consideration, and there's a pledge made. And basically, we're talking here about collateral for some loan or some use of equipment or something like that. There's a collateral. And the collateral that's talked about here is the millstone. So to steal a millstone from a person amounted basically to depriving him of his ability to grind grain and to make his daily bread is what we're talking about here. And evidently the upper or the small millstone is the one that's being talked about here, not the large millstone that is the one that pretty much stays stationary and the one that the animal walks around and turns. This is a small millstone that you can by hand grind up your grain to make your bread. So the point is here, you do not take a pledge or you do not take collateral of something that is going to affect the person's ability to feed themselves. And that's what we're talking about here. Comments about that verse? Probably doesn't mean a lot to us today, but it meant a lot to the people back then. Let's look at verse 7, and it's probably the last one we'll get to do today. If a man is found stealing a person of his brothers, the sons of Israel, and makes a slave of him, or sells him, that the thief shall die, and you shall put evil away from among you. So basically what we're talking about here in verse 7 is kidnapping. There is a law against stealing a man or kidnapping, and this violated the right of freedom of choice which God wanted every Israelite to enjoy. And it was not death by the law of Moses to steal cattle or goods, but to steal a child or a weak or simple person, or one that a man that had his power to make and merchandise himself. This was a capital crime. And even today, kidnapping is a capital crime in some states.
It's basically describing human trafficking.
Right. And really there was you couldn't send them back. Once you committed the crime, you can't just give them back. You're going to pay the cost for of your life for the kidnapping, and this was considered to be a very heinous offense. It was robbing the public of one of its members. It was taking away a man's liberty, the liberty of a freeborn Israelite, which was next in the value to his life. And it was driving a man out from the inheritance of the land and the privileges to which he was entitled as an Israelite. So this was a pretty serious situation. It was then, it is now, and it hopefully will continue to be. So any comments about that verse? Okay, I think we'll stop there. I've got just about a minute left, so I appreciate everybody's attention, comments, and we'll pick up with verse 8 next week.
David found out they don't do that in Israel.
They don't?
In 10 days, that's it.
10 days, okay. So they're not following quite to the letter.